Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty big, really fascinating, and honestly, potentially transformative. Germline genetic enhancement. We're looking at how these new reproductive technologies are basically opening doors we maybe never thought possible. And crucially, what the ethical and social fallout might be.
It's a huge discussion, definitely. And you've gathered some really useful sources for us. We've got a scientific review that digs into the ethical side,
Right.
an analysis of Gattaca, the movie, looking at it through a modern genetics lens.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
And some key discussions around genome editing itself. Oh, and for anyone curious about the basic science, there's an image in the show notes. It shows a gel electrophoresis result. It's kind of how scientists visualize and sort DNA fragments.
Good point. So our mission for this deep dive is really to try and unpack this really complex ethical landscape. We want to explore the potential ripples across society and also see how something like science fiction, like Gattaca, can actually give us a powerful way to think about the realities we might be, well, heading towards.
Absolutely. A reflection and maybe a warning.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute basics. What exactly is germline genetic enhancement? Can you break that down?
Sure. So at its core, germline genetic enhancement. It's about making intentional changes to the DNA,
Okay.
but specifically within the germ cells, that's the sperm and the egg cells, or potentially very early on in an embryo.
Right.
And what makes this so, well, profound is that these changes, these modifications, they become a permanent part of that individual's genetic code.
Permanent.
And crucially, they can be passed down to all subsequent generations.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's the key distinction from, say, other types of gene therapy.
Exactly. It's very different from what we call somatic gene therapy. In somatic therapy, the changes are made to non-reproductive cells like lung cells or blood cells. So those changes only affect the individual receiving the treatment. They aren't inherited. Germline is about changing the lineage.
Changing the lineage itself. Okay. Now, that review article we mentioned, it starts off by noting how these new technologies allow selection, right? Picking characteristics during pregnancy based on what the people involved want.
Yes, precisely. Based on the interests of the involved parties, as the article puts it.
And it even mentions this stated aim of, well, developing individuals who would excel in society. That sounds very deliberate, very designed.
It is. And that ambition immediately throws us into a whole range of ethical viewpoints, some really strongly opposed to each other.
Right.
The review article talks about what it calls the preventive trend, which is basically a stance arguing we should preserve human nature, protect it from germline modification.
Okay, so this is sort of the hands-off, let nature run its course perspective when it comes to our fundamental genetic blueprint.
Pretty much. Yep.
What are the main arguments driving that view?
Well, there are a few layers. The review points to concerns coming from certain Christian traditions, for example, and also from deontological philosophy, duty-based ethics. Both raise fundamental questions about whether it's right to alter what's seen as the essential core of being human, our DNA.
And then there's the philosopher Habermas. He had a specific argument, didn't he? I remember that being quite striking.
He did, yes. Habermas framed it as potentially making use of a person's being. The worry here is a kind of instrumentalization.
Instrumentalization, meaning?
Meaning treating human beings as if they're just biological material to be shaped and optimized, maybe according to market demands, which he argued could erode our inherent dignity.
You can really see the connection there. The review article also brought up concerns about things like genetic doping in sports, right?
Yeah.
And gene patents.
Exactly.
And even this idea of intense competition between people who've been, enhanced. It starts to paint a picture of a potentially very divided society.
A genetically stratified society, potentially.
Yeah.
And beyond those sort of philosophical or moral objections, there's also a very practical concern.
Okay.
Which is just the instability and, frankly, the unpredictability of these reprogenetic techniques, especially germline editing itself. We just don't fully understand the long-term effects.
Right. The potential for off-target effects or unintended consequences down the line.
Precisely. There's a significant risk of unforeseen problems. So it's not just about should we do this, but also can we actually do this safely and predictably.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
And the review really emphasizes that. It says a simple risk-benefit calculation isn't enough here.
Right.
We need a much, much deeper dive into concepts like identity, human nature, dignity, before we can even think about greenlighting these kinds of interventions responsibly.
Yeah, it makes total sense. When you're talking about potentially altering the human gene pool forever, the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to another critical angle. The rights of the individual who might be modified in this way.
Yes, this is a really important and thorny issue. The review article really hammers home the irreversible nature of germline changes.
Irreversible.
Once they're made, that's it. Not just for that person, but for all their descendants. And maybe the most critical point, the individual being modified has absolutely no say in it.
Right. They don't consent. These traits are chosen for them.
Exactly. They're imposed not by the, natural lottery of inheritance, but by deliberate decisions made by others, parents, doctors, society, perhaps.
That raises a really difficult question, doesn't it? What if that person grows up and doesn't want the traits they were given? If they reject that imposed identity, is there any recourse?
It creates potential for a completely new kind of injustice. The review draws a useful line here.
Okay.
With natural inheritance, say, you're unhappy with your height or a risk for a certain condition, there's no specific person you can blame or hold legally responsible. It's chance.
Right. The genetic lottery.
But with modified inheritance, it's a direct result of someone's deliberate action. Parents, guardians, clinicians. This opens up the possibility of legal responsibility, maybe even lawsuits, generations later.
Wow. So the act of choosing someone's genes could have legal ripple effects far into the future. That's quite something to think about.
It is, and the review also points out there's a pretty broad ethical consensus, generally, against doing interventions on children if those interventions carry serious risks that aren't clearly balanced by significant benefits.
Okay.
The idea is to respect their developing identity, their autonomy, and to avoid modifications that could harm them or, in the process, lead to the modification or destruction of other embryos, for instance.
Right. Okay, so we've touched on the science, the ethics, the individual rights. Let's bring in Gattaca now. That film from, the late 90s. It's almost become shorthand for these kinds of concerns.
Absolutely. It's often called a genetic dystopia, as the analysis article puts it. It imagines this future society where your life path is heavily, heavily influenced by your genetic profile determined right at conception.
And it sets up that stark division, the valids versus the invalids.
Exactly. The valids are the genetically enhanced ones designed for success. The invalids, like Vincent, the main character, are conceived naturally, carrying all the supposed flaws and predispositions. And what the film does so well is show how privilege gets baked in, how it becomes seen as natural because it's tied to genes. It basically guts the idea of social mobility based on effort. Your genes are your destiny.
Like a biological caste system. Right. Now, the analysis article we looked at does concede that the genetic predictions in Gattaca seem maybe unrealistically precise, right? Like predicting lifespan down to the minute.
That's true. Real-world genetic prediction isn't nearly that deterministic, especially for complex traits. But the article makes a really smart point, I think.
Which is?
That the film isn't necessarily arguing for that level of determinism. Instead, it's critiquing the social power that comes from believing in genetic determinism. The film shows the flaws in the system through Vincent's journey.
Ah, okay. So the exaggeration serves the critique. It's about the societal impact of overstating genetic influence, even if the science isn't quite there.
Precisely. It's a commentary on how we might use or misuse genetic information as a society.
That's a much more nuanced way to see it. And it lines up better with what we actually know scientifically, doesn't it?
It does. We know single gene disorders, Mendelian diseases, are often highly predictable from genetics.
Right.
But most common conditions, heart disease, diabetes, mental health issues, and complex traits like intelligence, they involve many, many genes interacting with each other and with the environment.
Yeah.
The article gives that striking statistic about identical twins and bipolar disorder. Even with the exact same genes, there's only about a 40% chance both twins will develop it. Shows how much else is involved.
That really drives home the limits of purely genetic prediction. But we're developing things like polygenic scores now, looking at lots of genes together.
Yes, and the analysis discusses those too. Polygenic risk scores, looking at hundreds or thousands of genetic variants, are showing some promise, maybe, for predicting risk for things like coronary artery disease.
But they also bring their own ethical baggage.
Oh, absolutely. Big ethical and legal questions, especially around the potential for genetic discrimination in insurance, employment, maybe elsewhere.
And the article mentioned GINA, that U.S. law, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. But it also said it has gaps.
Big gaps. GINA offers some protection against discrimination in health insurance and employment, but it doesn't cover life insurance, long-term care insurance, or disability insurance. And there have been cases where people faced issues in those areas based on genetic risk factors. Plus, it doesn't apply in other contexts like education or housing.
So our legal frameworks are still sort of scrambling to keep pace with the science.
Very much so. The technology is advancing incredibly fast.
Okay, let's circle back to Gattaca for a moment. That scene where Vincent's parents are talking to the geneticist about their second child, the valid one. What does that scene tell us about the type of technology being used in that world?
That's a really revealing scene. The geneticist says, "This child is still you, simply the best of you," while showing embryos on screen. This strongly suggests, as the analysis points out, that it's primarily about embryo selection, or maybe selecting sperm and egg, choosing the best combination rather than direct gene editing like CRISPR.
So selection more than editing.
Probably. The later comment about how natural conception could never produce such a result implies a very sophisticated screening and selection process.
And the parents are a bit uneasy, aren't they? Especially about
Right.
choosing cosmetic things. They want to leave something to chance.
They do, and the geneticist's response is quite chilling. Believe me, we have enough imperfection built in already.
Oof. Yeah.
It really speaks to that societal pressure towards a narrow definition of perfection and maybe a devaluing of natural human variation.
It also touches on something called pleiotropy, right? Where selecting for one thing affects another.
Exactly. The article brings this up, the complexity of genes. Selecting for, say, genes associated with higher educational attainment might inadvertently increase the risk for something like bipolar disorder. Genes often have multiple effects.
It's not like picking options off a menu. It's way more complicated.
Far more complicated. And it even raises questions about how we define disease versus normal variation.
And then there's the law enforcement angle in the film. Vincent's eyelash triggering a genetic manhunt. That feels very prescient now with real-world DNA databases like CODIS.
Incredibly prescient. The analysis makes that direct link, highlighting the real-world concerns about privacy, potential misuse, and even racial disparities in how these databases are populated and used.
Right.
The film even throws in that little puzzle, how do the police get Vincent's picture if he's unregistered? It hints at this future possibility of predicting physical appearance phenotype just from a DNA sample.
Which is something researchers are actually working on. Phenotype prediction.
They are. So the film is asking, what happens when our DNA becomes our ultimate ID card, used for all sorts of purposes?
Is there good or ill?
Exactly. And even tiny details like the 12-fingered pianist.
Wow.
It just raises questions about how a society obsessed with genetic perfection might treat any kind of variation. Is it accepted? Is it just seen as exotic? Or is it something to be eliminated?
It really feels like Gattaca, despite its sci-fi exaggerations, is just incredibly effective as a thought experiment. It forces us to confront the potential social consequences.
That's the core argument of the analysis, I think.
Yeah.
The film's power isn't just in predicting the science, but in showing the potential social force of believing too strongly in genetic destiny.
Okay, so to understand the scientific basis for some of these predictions, even the flawed ones, we should probably touch on heritability.
Yeah.
What does that term actually mean in genetics?
Right. Heritability, it's basically a statistical concept. It tries to estimate how much the observable differences, the variation we see in a trait within a specific group of people, can be attributed to the genetic differences among those people.
So it's about variation in a population, not about how much of my height is genetic.
Exactly. That's a common misunderstanding. It's a population statistic. Traditionally, scientists estimated it using twin studies comparing identical twins who share all their genes with fraternal twins who share about half.
The ACE model, right. Genes, shared environment, unique environment.
That's the classic approach, yes, trying to disentangle those factors. But now we're increasingly moving towards using actual genomic data.
How does that work?
Through things like genome-wide association studies, GWAs. They scan genomes of many people to find tiny variations, SNPs, associated with a trait. This data is used to estimate SNP heritability and also feeds into developing those polygenic scores we mentioned.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry we looked at was quite cautious about heritability measures, wasn't it? Even the newer genomic ones.
Very cautious. There's a strong philosophical consensus, actually, that heritability numbers themselves have pretty limited use, especially for making causal claims about individuals or comparing groups.
Why is that?
Well, partly because they are so context-dependent. Heritability can change depending on the population studied and the environment they live in, and there are still big debates about what polygenic scores really mean causally. Are they just predictive? Or do they represent direct biological pathways? It's complex.
And that encyclopedia entry mentioned the problem of portability.
Yes, that's a key limitation. A heritability estimate calculated in one population, say people of European ancestry living in the U.S. today, might not apply at all to a different population or even the same population in a different environment or time.
Right.
This lack of generalizability or portability is also a major issue for polygenic scores. A score developed in one group often performs poorly when applied to another ancestral group.
So even as we get more genetic data, interpreting it accurately and applying it fairly remains a huge challenge.
A massive challenge.
Okay, let's switch gears now to the current ethical and regulatory thinking. What are bodies like the Nuffield Council on Bioethics saying about actually doing heritable genome editing?
Well, the Nuffield Council, which is very influential, especially in the UK, has taken a cautious but not entirely prohibitive stance. They've recommended that if heritable genome editing interventions were ever to be permitted,
A big if.
a very big if, it should only be allowed on a case-by-case basis after rigorous assessment by a national regulatory body like the HFEA in the UK.
And with lots of safeguards.
Absolutely. Strict regulations, strong oversight, and crucially, long-term monitoring of the effects both on the individuals and on society as a whole.
But what's the actual legal status right now in most places?
Currently, in the UK and many other countries, using genome editing to create a baby making heritable changes for reproductive purposes is illegal. Flat out.
Okay.
Research using genome editing on human embryos is permitted in some places under strict rules, but those embryos cannot be used to establish a pregnancy. There's a clear line there, ethically and legally.
So for couples now who know they carry a serious genetic condition, what are their established options? The Nuffield report outlined those, didn't it?
Yes. The current options typically include things like adoption, using donor sperm or eggs, conceiving naturally and then using prenatal diagnosis, which might lead to a decision about terminating the pregnancy,
Right.
or using IVF combined with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD or PGT, where embryos are screened for the genetic condition before being implanted. Genome editing is being discussed as a potential future addition to these options.
And the Nuffield report also looked beyond just preventing disease, right, towards potential enhancements.
It did acknowledge those possibilities, yes. Theoretically, using genome editing to build in resistance to infections or increase tolerance to environmental factors, or even enhance senses or cognitive abilities.
That's very sci-fi.
It does, and they immediately follow that by stressing the huge uncertainties. We don't know if these things are truly feasible, if they can be done safely, or if they could ever be affordable or accessible in an equitable way. Lots of big ifs, as they put it.
And they really emphasize the need for public discussion.
Absolutely critical. They argue strongly that any decisions about permitting this technology must be shaped by broad, inclusive public debate about societal values and interests. It can't just be a decision for scientists or policymakers alone.
Yeah.
They also make the important point that welfare isn't just about avoiding disease. It includes psychological well-being, social factors, how people experience living in their particular body within their society. It's context-dependent.
And they recommended ongoing checks, right? Monitoring.
Yes. Continuous monitoring of any long-term effects if it were ever permitted, and regular reviews of whether it should remain permitted, maybe even imposing a moratorium if significant problems emerge.
It seems like a very cautious step-by-step approach is being advocated.
Definitely. And underpinning it all is that fundamental question they pose. Does pursuing heritable genome editing pose a threat to our common humanity?
That really is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Now, just to add one more layer to our Gattaca discussion, we found that interesting Reddit analysis looking at color symbolism in the film. It sounds a bit niche, maybe, but it seemed quite insightful.
It was surprisingly insightful. It argues the film uses color very intentionally to track Vincent's journey and underscore the themes.
Okay, like how?
So yellow, according to this analysis, consistently highlights Vincent's invalid status, his perceived genetic inferiority, his past limitations. It shows up in scenes emphasizing that identity.
Interesting. And blue.
Blue is linked to the artificial, the genetically engineered, valid world. It represents Jerome's identity, the genetic material Vincent uses, that sort of cold, controlled perfection.
Right, so yellow for natural inferior, blue for artificial superior.
Kind of, yeah. And green acts as the transition between them.
The mix of yellow and blue.
Exactly. It often appears when Vincent is aspiring to be Jerome, using his identity, bridging those two worlds. But it also carries a hint of danger, the risk of his true identity being exposed.
That makes the rocket launch scene even more potent. the yellow smoke trail from Vincent's rocket piercing the blue sky of the valid world.
Precisely. His invalid dream penetrating that engineered society. And then, crucially, there are moments where color drains away.
Like when?
After his final swim with his brother, and during the actual space launch at the very end, the analysis suggests this shift to black and white, or lack of dominant color, signifies transcendence.
Transcendence.
Yeah, moving beyond the whole valid and invalid dichotomy, reaching a state where those genetic labels don't define him anymore. It even links red tones, representing biology, genotype, to the blue, physical manifestation, phenotype, suggesting the final black and white is a realm untethered from those constraints.
Wow. That adds a whole visual poetry to it.
Mm.
And finally, that Reddit post also talked about Vincent and Jerome's identities merging.
Yes, it framed it as Vincent representing spiritual triumph, pure will, while Jerome represents the peak of physical perfection, but is ultimately broken spiritually.
So they combine.
Metaphorically, yes. Vincent's soul, if you like, uses Jerome's perfect body to achieve his dream of reaching space. Jerome enables Vincent's ascent.
That's quite a take. But there was a counter-argument mentioned, too.
There was. A reference to the philosopher Nevin Sasardic, who apparently viewed the ending more critically as a kind of fanaticism of the will, questioning whether Vincent's relentless optimism and drive really makes sense given the supposedly deterministic genetic limits shown in the film. Like, where does this superhuman will come from if genes are supposed to dictate everything?
So even the interpretation of the ending is complex and debated, much like the whole topic we've been discussing today.
Exactly. It brings us back full circle. We've covered a lot: the deep ethical questions, the potential societal shifts, the philosophical debates sparked by germline enhancement.
Drawing on the science, the ethics reviews, and that powerful cultural mirror in Gattaca.
And it's clear there's still so much uncertainty about the technology itself, its potential benefits, but also the very significant risks.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What are the right boundaries for us intervening in our own biology? How much do our social values color how we see genetic differences? And maybe most importantly, what responsibility do we actually have to future generations when we're developing and maybe one day using technologies this powerful?
Those are absolutely the key questions we need to keep asking, keep debating. We'd really encourage you, the listener, to maybe look more into some of the ethical frameworks we touched on, keep an eye on the science as it develops.
And participate in the conversation.
Exactly. Engage with these vital societal debates. They really concern all of us.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you plenty to think about. We'll be back soon with another exploration.